Have you guys ever been chosen for something? But let me ask it this way. Have you ever not been chosen for something? I don't know if you guys did this or not when you were kids, but when I was a kid, all the neighborhood kids would come together and we would play games and sports and stuff. And it generally followed the same pattern no matter what sport we were going to play. We chose the two kids who were the best athletes, and we told them they were captains. That way they'll end up on the same team and dominate. So we would have these two kids be captains. And then those two would go through the process of choosing. They would choose who they wanted on their team. And it would usually start with the next best available athlete. The kid that they thought would be the highest scorer or the best goalie. And then after that kid was chosen, then the next person would choose, the next best kid. And it would kind of go like that. And if you've ever been in that, you know what it's like to stand in that group of kids as the captains are choosing people and the group is getting smaller, but you're still standing there. And I was an okay athlete. I wasn't a star athlete by any means. So I usually got chosen. I wasn't usually the last one to get picked, but there were times, depending on the sport, like soccer, which I was terrible at, that everybody knew you didn't want Dave Ricker on your team, and I would be the last one standing there, wondering if anybody even wanted me on their team at all. And it's not a great feeling. But if there is anything that's worse than that, it's when there's an odd number of kids, which means that the last kid standing doesn't get picked. I have been that kid too. That is a terrible feeling. I know some of you have probably gone through that as well when you were kids, but this idea isn't isolated to when we're kids, though. This same kind of thing happens throughout our life. There's these moments when there's a choice to be made, and the question is, will you be chosen or not? Maybe when you're of dating age. There's a girl or a boy that you're really interested in. But despite your best efforts, they choose someone else. Or maybe when you graduate high school, you're applying for colleges. And you're sending out the letters to the ones that you really want to go to. And maybe you don't hear back from any of those colleges. They didn't choose you to be a part of their school. Or maybe after college, or if you don't go to college and you're just going to go out into the workforce, you send out resumes to places that you'd like to work. Maybe if you're lucky, you get a call back. Maybe if you're even luckier, you get an interview. But have you ever made it that far in the process, only to find out that they chose someone else? I have. That's a terrible feeling, and it reminds me of what it was like to be a kid on that sports field. Just wondering, does anybody really even want me on their team at all? And this continues as we go through life. Well, this idea of being chosen, this is something that we're going to see in this passage today. And we're going to see it in such a beautiful way. I hope this passage is as much of an encouragement to you as it has been to me. And so I don't even want to hesitate anymore. I just want to dive into this. We're in Luke chapter 6. We're going to be in verse 12 through 16. If you want to follow along in your own Bible, I will have the text on the screen. I'm just going to kind of work my way through this passage and make some comments as we go. So in Luke chapter 6, starting in verse 12, it says, "In these days, he," this is Jesus, "went out to the mountain to pray. And all night he continued in prayer to God." So already there's some stuff to look at here. It says, "in these days." The way that Luke sets up his gospel, we talked about this last week, he just showed us this building tension between him and the Pharisees over these series of events where the Pharisees are becoming more and more agitated until the point where last week we saw that the Pharisees are now plotting to kill Jesus. Those are the days, it says, when Jesus went out to a mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. Now, when was the last time when you had a big decision to make that you spent all night alone with God in prayer? Has anybody ever done that? Here's something to consider. If the Son of God himself, on the eve of having to make one of the more important decisions in his ministry, needed to go and be alone with the Father and pray all night long before he made that decision, then I might venture to say perhaps we should probably do something similar too. When you are in need of making a decision, are you quicker to pray and go to Google than you are to pray and go to God? Are you quicker to seek advice from everyone else? Are you comfortable and confident sitting in silence and waiting until the Lord speaks and gives you guidance in that? Again, I would say, if Jesus needed to do it, I think we probably need to be doing it even more. Certainly not less. So in those days, as we're going to find out, on the eve of Jesus having to make an important decision, he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And then, when day came, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles. So there's a bit of a distinction here between disciples and apostles. Jesus regularly, throughout his ministry, had large groups of people who were just following him. These are the disciples. They would come and they would go. They would come because they were hungry sometimes. And they had heard that Jesus is miraculously making bread from heaven. And they wanted their fill of bread. And so they would come. They would come because they were sick, or someone that they loved was sick. And they would bring them to Jesus. Then when they got what they needed, they would go. Some of them would come to listen to Jesus teach and to preach until they didn't like what he said. Remember the story. Jesus was telling this large group of disciples, probably thousands of people were following him at that time. And he said to them, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in me. And what did those thousands of disciples do? They left. That was the groups that were following Jesus. But Jesus took that group of people, like a captain on a sports team, and he said, I'm going to choose 12. And that number 12 is actually really important. It's quite symbolic. It represents the fulfillment of the promises that the prophets spoke of, the restoration of Israel. That's exactly what Jesus is doing here by picking 12. It wasn't an accidental number. It wasn't coincidental. This is the 12 Israelites with whom he is going to restore the nation of Israel. These become the pillar of the church, in fact. Well, 12 minus 1, as we're going to find out as the story goes on. So, Jesus has this big decision to make. There's been building tension between him and the religious leaders. He goes to pray all night long, and then being guided by God, he chooses 12 whom he is going to name his apostles. Now, the disciples are those who come to learn. Apostles are those that are sent to teach. That's the biggest difference. And they carry with them a certain level of authority because they're carrying the authority of the one who sent them. The idea of being an apostle isn't something that's specifically kind of confined to the Bible. Political leaders would do this as well. They would send out a messenger to go and carry a message somewhere, like an envoy, Well, that's the idea of being an apostle. You're being sent out with a message, and you have a certain level of authority, however much authority the person who sent you had. So Jesus is calling, and he's about to choose. He's going to choose who he wants to be on his team. Think about how we choose, right? Think about that picture, that you're a kid on a sports field, and the captains are choosing who they want on their team. Think about how we choose. And then read this list. This is who he chooses. Simon, whom he named Peter, and Andrew, his brother. Simon, who later gets the name Peter. Actually, in Matthew and Mark, there's a very definitive moment when Jesus changes Simon's name. Luke doesn't really mention that, except for here. And then for the rest of his gospel, he refers to him as Peter. So Simon is a very interesting choice, I have to say. Simon is, I like Simon Peter because he reminds me so much of me. He's a guy who experiences the highest of highs and the lowest of lows, but manages to put those two things incredibly close to each other. He experiences the highest moments and then the lowest moments in fractions of a moment. Case in point, in the event in Mark's gospel where Simon gets his new name, Peter, he gets this new name because Jesus is asking these 12 men, who is everyone everyone saying I am? Who do the people say that I am? And they say, well, they think you're a prophet. Some of them think you're John the Baptist who's been raised from the dead. They're saying all kinds of stuff. And he asks them, well, who do you say that I am? And it is Simon who speaks up and says, you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus says, I'm going to paraphrase here, now you're thinking God's thoughts. He says to him, surely you did not think of this on your own, Peter. This has been given to you from the Father. Now you're thinking God's thoughts. And in the very next verse, pretty much, we find that Jesus is telling his disciples, his apostles, now it's time for me to begin going to Jerusalem, where I will be crucified and killed. And Peter stands up and he says, no, Lord, let it not be so. To which Jesus responds, get behind me, Satan. You're not thinking God's thoughts anymore. Now you're just thinking man's thoughts. Highest of highs, lowest of lows, moments apart. Another really famous story for Simon is when he's walking on water. A lot of people recognize that Jesus walked on water. More, I think, incredible is the fact that Peter walked on water. They're in a boat in the middle of the night, in the middle of a stormy sea. Jesus isn't in the boat with them. He stayed on land, and the next thing they know, here comes Jesus. Most of them think he's a ghost, and they freak out. But Peter says to him, Lord, if it is you, call to me, and I will come to you. And Jesus says, come. So Peter gets out of the boat in the middle of the night with no reason to think that this is going to go well. He just has incredible faith in that moment. And he walks on water until the lightning flashes. And then he gets scared and he starts drowning. Highest of highs, lowest of lows, moments apart. That's Simon. That's Peter. That's who Jesus chose. That's his number one pick. Okay? That's like the captain of the team is picking first. He picks Peter. Incredible. And he also chooses his brother Andrew. We don't know a whole lot about Andrew from Scripture, but there is some really interesting stuff about him from church history. In John's Gospel, we actually find out that Andrew was the first disciple of Jesus. This is why the Greek Orthodox Church will refer to him as the Proto-Cletus, the first called. In John's Gospel, we find that Andrew he's a disciple of John the Baptist to start. And as Andrew is there with John the Baptist in the Jordan, there's a day when Jesus comes. And John the Baptist points out, he says, behold the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sins of the world. And it says in John 1, at that moment, Andrew followed Jesus. He recognized exactly what John the Baptist was saying. He recognized that the ministry of John the Baptist was to prepare the way for Jesus. And Andrew goes, and he is the first one to truly start following Jesus. And the first thing he does is he goes to find Simon, his brother. And he brings him to Jesus saying, we have found the Messiah. And then at some point later after that, Jesus is walking on the shore. And he comes to these two men who are just simple, ordinary fishermen. And he says, come follow me. And both Andrew and his brother Peter drop their nets, leave everything to come and follow Jesus. And at the same time that happens, Jesus also calls these other two to be his disciples, James and John. They too were just simple, ordinary fishermen. There was nothing spectacular about who they were. We don't know too much about James, except for that he had the nickname James the Greater, which is an awesome nickname to have. Especially when you consider that later on, as you see, there's another James. That James gets the unfortunate name of James the Lesser. A lot of people think it's just because James the Greater was probably really tall. In fact, if you've ever watched the Chosen series, that's why they make James really, really tall, because that's kind of what they think it must have meant. Not that he was greater in moral stature, because surely it proves not to be the case as you go through these gospel stories. Because James and his brother John get another nickname, Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. And the way they get this nickname is hilarious, and it reveals something about them. They're ministering to the Samaritans, and they're not receiving Jesus and his message very well. And James and John respond to this rejection of Jesus by asking Jesus if he would like them to call down fire from heaven to destroy them, like Sodom and Gomorrah, just wipe them out. To which Jesus kind of responds, he gives them this nickname, Sons of Thunder. They were fiery, they were passionate, and one thing I like about reading through the different Gospels is you can see this kind of competitive nature between John and Peter, especially when you read John's Gospel. Because John never refers to himself in the first person. He only ever refers to himself as the one whom Jesus loved. And I think the funniest thing is if you go and you read the Gospel accounts of Easter morning, if you read Mark's Gospel, which is widely believed to be Peter's Gospel, written through a scribe named Mark. Mark would have been Peter's disciple, and he had him pen the Gospel for him. If you read that, and then you go and read John's, honestly, it is hilarious. Because John makes it a point to say things like, even though Peter and John were running, John got there first. It's like, why did you put that in there? But as you go through the Gospels, you do kind of see that John and James, they did have an agenda. They wanted to be Jesus' right and left hand men. In fact, there's an occasion where they come to Jesus and they say, Jesus, when you come into your kingdom, will you put us as your right and your left hand? They wanted to be the number 2 and number 3 guy, with Jesus being the number 1 guy. That's who these guys were. Fiery, stubborn, prideful, arrogant, people with their own agenda. That's who Jesus chose. And then you've got Philip, who again we don't find really too much about, other than he came from the same town as Peter and Andrew, Bethsaida, which is a middle of the nowhere town in Galilee. He's probably a fisherman too, perhaps. And then there's this guy, Bartholomew. Now, you won't find Bartholomew listed in John's Gospel. Instead, you find a guy named Nathaniel. And you won't find Nathaniel listed in these other lists in the Gospels. So what most people think is that Bartholomew is Nathaniel. Same as you remember a couple weeks ago when we were talking about Jesus calling Levi the tax collector? Well, that's Matthew, right? It was common for people to have multiple names. Sometimes they'd have a Greek name and an Aramaic name, or a Hebrew name. And then sometimes you would have a name like this, Bartholomew. The part that's Bar, that actually just means son of. You'll see this sometimes. You'll see Simon Bar-Jonah, for example, right? What that means is this guy is probably just being referred to as the son of Tholomew, which actually in Greek would have been Ptolemy, like P-T-O-L-E, Ptolemy. So this might have just been a way of referring to him. It's possible Ptolemy was a well-known guy. So for you to say that this is the son of Ptolemy, people would just kind of know that. But either way, I do think that this is Nathaniel. And Nathaniel is an interesting guy. There's a story when Jesus meets him. It's Philip who introduces Jesus to Nathaniel. And Philip introduces him as Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah. To which Nathaniel responds, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" And Jesus says, "Truly, here is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Right? This is the first century version of facts don't care about your feelings. This is Nathaniel. He's just giving you the truth. Might hurt. Don't really care. I'm telling you exactly what I think. That's Nathaniel. Interesting choice. And then you've got Matthew. We've already talked about at length. A tax collector. Then you've got Thomas. The doubter. The guy who, when Jesus is resurrected and shows up in the room with the apostles, but Thomas isn't there. And all the other apostles are telling Thomas, Jesus has arisen. Thomas responds by saying, listen, unless I put my hand in the wound in his side and my finger in the wounds in his hands, I will never believe what you're telling me. That's Thomas. Who else do we got? James, the son of Alphaeus. We really don't know too much about him, except for, like I said, he gets the name James the Lesser. It is possible that he's related to Matthew. Matthew elsewhere is referred to as the son of Alphaeus, but Alphaeus may seem like a unique name to us today, but back then it really wasn't. I mean, it's like saying the son of David, right? There's at least 2 Davids in the church right now, so who are we talking about, right? He gets this son of Alphaeus to distinguish him most importantly from James, the brother of John. We don't know too much about him from the scriptures, or really from church history. Then there's Simon, who is called the Zealot. The Zealots were a radical group of rebellious Jews who sought to use physical force to enact their religious agenda. That sounds like a terrorist, because that's basically what they were. They were the ones who were causing all kinds of problems because they wanted to use physical force in order to enact what they thought was God's plan. And it was the Zealots who in AD 66 started the war with Rome, which ultimately ended in AD 70, which if you don't have that year committed to memory, you should. So AD 70 is a very important year for the church. It is the year when Rome officially squashed this Jewish rebellion and destroyed the Jewish temple. AD 70. It was the Zealots who started that war. They were essentially guerrilla warriors. Depending on which side of it you're on, you might consider them to be terrorists. I mean, it's essentially the same kind of idea, just it carries different connotations. But that's who Simon was. And then you've got Judas, the son of James, who again, we don't know too much about. But then you get this guy, Judas Iscariot. Luke doesn't even, he just foreshadows it for us. He just tells us right on the front end who became a traitor. It was Judas Iscariot who betrayed Jesus with a kiss, who handed him over to the religious authorities for a handful of silver. Think about that. Jesus chose him. But look at the rest of the list too. Like, who are these guys that Jesus would choose them? I mean, really, think about it. There's hundreds of people in this group. This is the best of the best? I kind of doubt it, honestly. And that brings up an interesting question. Why in the world would God choose people like this? They're just ordinary people. There's nothing special about them. They don't come from fantastic backgrounds. Apart from Matthew, most of them probably don't even have any real money. They're not the most eloquent. They're mostly uneducated. A lot of them are just fishermen and tradesmen. It's not like they're the most faith-filled people. I mean, we've got Simon, we've got Thomas, we've got Judas Iscariot. What is God up to? Why would he choose people like that? Well, I would say because it's exactly the kind of thing that God does. These are exactly the kind of people that God chooses. And he makes it a point to tell us that. You can see it all the way through the Old Testament. I've chosen this one because I think this is a great example. In Deuteronomy 7, God is speaking to the chosen people of Israel, and he says to them, "You are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession. Out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth, it was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." God didn't choose Israel because they were the best choice. In fact, a part of me thinks he chose them because they might just have been the worst choice. Because if Israel had accomplished great things on their own, and everyone just expected that this nation would accomplish great things, no one would look at it and go, "Wow, look at what God did." So no, instead, he chooses what Paul would say. He doesn't choose the wisest. He doesn't choose the most powerful. He doesn't choose those who come from noble birth. No. God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. Because of him, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption. Think about what Paul's saying there. God didn't choose the wisest, did he? He didn't choose the strongest. He didn't choose the most famous. He didn't choose the most charismatic. He didn't choose the best looking. He didn't choose those with the most money. No, he chose the foolish, weak, and lowly things of this world. You know, people like us. So the question isn't, what was God thinking in choosing people like Simon and Andrew and James and John and Matthew and Thomas and Philip and Nathaniel? I think the greater question is, what was God thinking in choosing us? Why would he choose us? Maybe I'll speak to myself here. I am not the brightest bulb in the bunch. I am not the strongest, most powerful, most cunning, most crafty, best person at planning and administration. What is God thinking when he chose me? Not just to be his son, but to be a pastor in a church. Like, I honestly regularly ask him this question: God, what were you thinking? What are you doing here? Like, this doesn't make any sense. But that's the point. That's the point. God chooses people like us, just ordinary people, so that when he does something through us, he gets all the credit. That's amazing. And when you think about how he has now carried over these promises to us, the church, that we are now considered a chosen people, we are God's chosen people, that's incredible. What an honor. What a privilege. Who were we that he would choose us? We're the weak, we're the foolish, we're the lowly. We're just ordinary people. Just like those 12 that he chose that day after a night of prayer, Jesus chose ordinary people. But then he did extraordinary things through them. Every one of those guys. Jesus did extraordinary things through them. This was the team of people that he was going to turn the world upside down with. Yes, even Judas. Apart from Judas, Judas wouldn't have went to the cross. Jesus needed to be betrayed into the hands. And God did an extraordinary thing even through Judas. Now, I would not encourage you to take that path in life, but he did use him. But I mean, Simon, right? He goes from being this waffling guy who's lacking faith to being the head of the church, the leader of the church, the very rock and foundation of the church. He's responsible for taking the gospel to the heart of the Roman Empire, Rome, and ultimately giving his life there for the work of the ministry. His brother Andrew took the gospel all the way up into Ukraine and Russia. In fact, there's a really cool story. He made it to what is now modern-day Kiev. And he planted a cross there in the ground on a hill overlooking the city. And he had prophesied over that place that it would become a great city one day. And now it is. It's Kiev in Ukraine. And Andrew also ended up being crucified and killed. But just like Peter refused to be crucified in the manner of Jesus, so Peter was crucified upside down, his brother Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross. In fact, they call it St. Andrew's cross. And if you ever look at a Russian naval flag, you will see a dominant X. In fact, it's usually just a white flag with a blue X. That X is St. Andrew's cross. He is the patron saint of Russia, of Ukraine. He's the patron saint of the Greek Orthodox Church, because they believe that he's the proto-Cletus, he's the first called. So just like the Roman Catholic Church kind of exalts Peter, the Greek Orthodox Church exalts Andrew. Think about that. Both of those guys, these two brothers, they're just fishermen. They're just sitting there one day, going about their business, fishing. And Jesus comes to them and says, "Follow me." And their lives were never the same. He accomplished extraordinary things through these ordinary guys. And the same is true of all the rest of them too. Philip took the gospel to Ethiopia by preaching to a eunuch. Thomas, the doubter, took the gospel to India. The gospel moved to the ends of the earth, starting with these ordinary people. God took these ordinary people and did extraordinary things through them, because that is exactly what God does. And he didn't stop doing it when the Bible stopped being written. He's been doing this throughout history. Many of you might know the name Billy Graham. But did you know that he was born the son of a farmer in rural North Carolina. He didn't come from some crazy background. He was just a farming kid with a call on his life. And through that ordinary kid, God did extraordinary things. Because Billy Graham became one of the most predominant evangelists of the last century. There's another guy too, maybe you don't know his name. I think you might after this, because his name is Smith Wigglesworth, which is just an awesome name. Smith Wigglesworth was a guy who was born in England to a dirt poor family with a bunch of kids. They couldn't even afford for him to stay in school, so in about the 3rd or 4th grade, he was pulled out of school so that he could go to work, to learn a trade, so he learned plumbing. And so he was essentially a functioning illiterate with just knowledge of the trades. And then he met Jesus. And Jesus did a work in him and transformed him and gave him a passion for sharing the gospel. And this man is responsible for leading tens of thousands of people to Christ in England. And then he made a trip over to the United States and had a powerful ministry here as well. He's most famously known for his peculiar way of ministering to people. He was a Pentecostal, so we'll cut him some slack, we'll give him a little grace. Okay? He was a Pentecostal, so he believed in the power of healing. And I'll tell you what, for us Baptists, you want to talk about whether healings are still for today, you should read the biography of Smith Wigglesworth and try and explain to me how it is that he did some of these things. Because many, many, many miraculous healings were done through this guy. But like I said, he's a little peculiar. So there's this one story when he came to America. There was a woman who came to one of these tent meetings that they were doing, and she had cancer in her stomach. And so she came up to pray. And as Mr. Wigglesworth is praying for her, he punches her in the stomach. She was so offended, she slapped him in the face and turned around and walked out. Well, yeah, right? Like, what she didn't understand is how Mr. Wigglesworth functioned. See, when he saw her, he perceived the cancer in her. And he was so filled with a holy fury that he punched the cancer and not her. And the next day, she came back to that camp meeting and had to apologize, not only to Mr. Wigglesworth, but to the rest of the group, because the cancer was gone. She did not know what he was doing. And there are many, many stories just like that. People who come in wheelchairs, walk out. In fact, there's one story that's so hard to believe, honestly, the Baptist in me finds it impossible to believe. There's a story that they brought this young boy to him who didn't even have eye sockets. So you're talking about blind receiving sight? This boy didn't even have eyes. And he prayed for the boy and placed his hands over where his eyes should be. And when he took his hands away, there were eyes. And the boy could see. And I can tell from your faces that I'm speaking to a bunch of Baptists. I know. I'm telling you. Read his biography. I've got a copy of it in my office. It will challenge your view on whether the gifts are for today or not. I will tell you that. But either way, no matter whether you believe in the healings or not, Smith Wigglesworth was a dirt poor boy from the middle of nowhere, England. And God put a calling on his life and led thousands, tens of thousands of people to Christ through this man and his ministry. Now, a lot of us, does anybody here know the name Fanny Crosby? Something tells me Leonard does. Leonard, do you know Fanny Crosby?
She died before I was born.
Okay. Sorry. she's a relatively modern hymn writer. I didn't know when she was born. I meant, do you know who she is? So, Fanny Crosby is a very, very famous hymn writer. She wrote the hymn Blessed Assurance, along with many, many other ones. A lot of people maybe don't know her name, but they do know her work. But I didn't know this.
Also, our first hymn this morning was like Fanny Crosby.
Get out, was it really?
Yeah.
I didn't even know that. Wow, that's God. So, she also wrote the first hymn that we wrote, sang this morning. She was blind from 6 weeks old because some imposter pretended to be a doctor and gave terrible advice. And as a result, she lost her sight. She was blind. She not only became a prolific hymn writer, but she also was integral in improving the education for the blind. And she was a passionate evangelist with City Missions. Just a simple girl, blind, almost from birth. And yet God got a hold of her and did extraordinary things through her life. And then there's this one too. I doubt anybody knows this name, but it's an amazing story. Gladys Aylward. She was a girl who from a young age had a deep passion for sharing the gospel, and she had a calling on her life to go to China. So she enlisted with Inland China Missions, which is an organization that would send missionaries. They train you and they equip you and they send you. Well, there's like classwork associated with that, and she did so poorly in the classwork that she essentially failed out of the organization. And where others might see that as the end of the road, it was just the beginning of her journey. She got on a train and went to China anyways. Just got off the train and started following wherever God would lead her, and led her to an orphan. She did what she could to help that orphan. And then she realized that there was a lot of orphans in China at that time because of their policies. And they were also being very cruel to children, particularly young girls. There was an ancient practice of binding their feet, but there had been an edict passed that said that you couldn't do this to them anymore. But the parents obviously didn't want to follow that. And so she was enlisted by one of the powerful authority figures there to try and enforce that. That she would go in and she would not permit parents to bind their children's feet. And she ministered like this for a long time until World War II started, when China and Japan went to war. And Japan actually invaded China. And so she single-handedly transported thousands of orphan kids on foot across the Chinese mountains to get them to a river where there was a boat so they could cross the border and be safe. She was just an ordinary person. She wasn't anything particularly fantastic. She's not the kind of person that if you and I were choosing someone to go and change the world, that we would have chosen her. But God did. He chose this ordinary girl, as well as all of these other ordinary people, and he did extraordinary things. And this is where I want to invite you. I want to invite you to give God your ordinary life. You and I, we're nothing special. We're just like everybody else that God uses, though. We are exactly the kind of people that God uses to do extraordinary things. And so I want to invite you to give God your ordinary life and let him do something extraordinary with it. You know, young men, I see a number of you here. I remember the feeling of being 18, 19, 20 years old and just wanting so badly to do something with my life, to make it matter that I lived. Guys, there's nothing that you can do better than giving control of your life over to him. You want to do something that matters? Give your life to him and watch what he does with it. You don't have to figure out how to make a difference in this world. He will make a difference through you if you let him. But that's not just them, it's all of us. Do you want it to matter that you lived? When you die, do you want to leave a legacy? Do you want the loss of you to mean something? I don't think we can accomplish that on our own. And I think if we tried, it would be in vain. But I know from history, from scripture, that if ordinary people give God control of their life, he has a habit of doing extraordinary things through them. And so I want to invite you. I'm going to do something that I don't normally do. In a moment, when I start to sing this last song, if you feel in your heart that God is pulling on you today, to maybe for the first time ever in your whole life, to say, Jesus, my life is yours. I've been trying to figure out how to make a difference. I've been trying to figure out how to live a life of meaning. Lord, I want to give my life to you. If something within your heart is pulling at you right now, I want you to know that that is Jesus knocking on the door of your heart. Open it up and let him in. But perhaps, maybe you have already given your life to Jesus once or twice or a handful of times. I want you to take today as an opportunity as well. If something within you is resonating and you're feeling like when you first came to Christ, there was a fire that burned in your belly. that you were determined to live a life for God and Him alone, but yet over the years, perhaps that has died down. Then I want you to take this as an opportunity to answer the call as well. Let today be a day when you recommit yourself to the Lord. And so as I start to play and sing this next song, if any of what I just said resonates with you, would you please come up to the front, or maybe we'll have somebody in the back. Maybe Bill and Romaine will stay in the back if you'd like. We're going to have some people standing up here that are ready to pray with you. I prepped them for this before the service. So if you are ready today to maybe for the first time give your life to Jesus, come forward. Tell somebody exactly what you're thinking and feeling, and let them pray with you. Or if you're somebody that is ready today to recommit your life to Him in a way that maybe you haven't in a while, don't be shy. There's going to be people up here. Come forward and let them pray with you. Tell them exactly what you're thinking, what you're feeling, and have them pray for you.